And we have a go for auto sequence start. Discovery's onboard computers have primary control of all the vehicle's critical functions. Start, 2, 1, booster ignition, and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery.
Welcome to the Launch Pad. I'm your host, Harry Washington. And those of you new to the show is sponsored by Pursuing a Dream Corporation. Pursuing a Dream Corporation is a nonprofit organization that encourages students to pursue degrees and careers in the areas of science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM. Today's segment is focused on the fields of psychology, and particularly careers. And in honor of Women's History Month, we're joined by two psychologists, clinical psychologists, Dr. Angela Priester and Dr. Ayanna Lynch. Welcome to the show, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, just to help our guests, give us a little bit of background on you guys in terms of education and work.
Okay.
I'll start with you, Dr. Priester.
All right. I have a PhD in clinical psychology. That includes that was a 4-year degree, including my 1-year internship. After that, my first jobs were working at a hospital part-time, and I worked at a foster care agency part-time. Okay. Since then, I've worked in public and private settings, and I'm currently in private practice providing consulting work and also in outpatient counseling.
How long have you been in private practice?
About 10 years now.
Okay. Dr. Lynch?
I also have a PhD in clinical psychology. Mine's from Howard University, right down the road. Okay. And my area of specialization was children and adolescents. Okay. So most of my training has been with children and adolescents with various disorders, ranging from mood disorders to ADHD to schizophrenia. However, I've had lots of experience working with adults as well. So I have been trained, my internship year, which is the final year of training for clinical psychologists, was in New York. Oh, wow. The Boogie Down Bronx in particular. And I had lots of training there with both children and adolescents and adults.
How many years of experience do you have in the field?
Oh, goodness. If you count graduate school, because you do get trained, it does count as experience. I have over 15 years of experience. Wow.
Mm-hmm. And currently you're in a very prestigious position, am I right?
Well, thank you. I think it's prestigious. All right. Currently, I am an assistant professor at Bowie State University, right down the road. Go Bulldogs.
Exactly. Go Bulldog. Bulldog proud of you.
Right.
Okay.
Where I've been there for 5 years now.
Now, I mean, ladies, and I'll start with you, Dr. Priest. What exactly is the field of clinical psychology? Because people hear that term, and it seems like a big, broad term. But what is clinical psychology?
Clinical psychology is the study of mental health and different psychological disorders, mostly. And as a clinical psychologist, your goal is to help people to learn how to manage their emotions and behavior so they could be successful in life despite having mental health disorders.
Now, what particular disorders do you deal with?
Oh, I work with a gamut similar to Dr. Lynch here. Mm-hmm. Most commonly, I would say I see ADHD, schizophrenia, anxiety, depression.
Okay. What about you, Dr. Lynch?
Those are pretty much the most common types of disorders that you would see in any practice. Lots of behavior disorders. Often children are referred by their teachers or their parents when issues arise. Okay. Sometimes they can need testing. Clinical psychology, fortunately, is a very broad degree. So most people, when they hear clinical psychology, they think of someone laying on a couch and hearing all their problems and tell me about your childhood and all that kind of stuff. But it's a much broader field. Okay. So there is therapy. That's what most people are familiar with. However, there's testing, or assessment. So a lot of times people need to find out what the root causes of their behavior issues or their mood issues, or find out if they have a learning disability, and so on and so forth. So much of my training has been with testing, not only in the schools, but in courts and things like that.
Now, and I'll stay with you, Dr. Lynch. What influenced your interest in the field of psychology?
That's an interesting question. I'm glad you asked. I feel like I have a non-traditional path. It's not, most people think, oh, I've known I wanted to be in this field since I was like 6 years old. Not so much for me. It was something that was interesting to me. I find that most people who do gravitate towards this field already have a natural curiosity about people. They're very inquisitive and very analytical. So naturally, it was something I was interested in. I also had some people around me that influenced. People I babysat for when I was in high school happened to be psychologists. I had the opportunity to take a psychology class as an elective as a high school student. And I chose it as a major as an undergrad because actually I was planning on going to med school. So I was a pre-med major, but there was not an actual pre-med I was interested in pre-med, but there was no pre-med major. So as long as you fulfilled the sciences, you can major in drama if you wanted to. So I chose what was interesting to me. And it wasn't until my senior year, as I was preparing to make plans for graduate school, that an advisor had suggested this path. And I took a really interesting class brain and behavior that really changed the way I saw psychologists.
Okay.
In particular, I thought when it came to research, I thought they only wore white lab coats and played with rats and mice. And I didn't realize that there's so much more to the field. So
Excellent.
that was a major turning point for me, and I applied to grad school.
Dr. Priest, what influenced your interest in psychology?
Well, it's interesting when she was talking about the traditional approach. I was one as a child. I loved working with children and knew I wanted to work with children. I went to college not knowing if I wanted to be a pediatrician or a child psychologist. And then the coursework that I took in college kind of spiked my interest more along the psychology realm. So that's why I applied to graduate school to be a psychologist.
Now, I'll stay with you, Dr. Priest. How much training does it take to be a clinical psychologist?
Well, I've learned that this has evolved over the years. When I was in graduate school in the 80s, it took most people 4 to 5 years, including their internship. In preparation for this show, I asked some of my younger colleagues about this and found out that now going to school full-time, including your internship, is taking 5 to 6 years.
Wow.
Some people it takes longer. Some people still are able to do it in 4 years, depending on your program.
Okay.
But most people are taking longer. And I think an important thing to consider in applying to graduate school is whether it's accredited by the American Psychological Association. Some are and some are not.
Dr. Lynch, what are some of the obstacles that you've encountered in your professional career?
I would say actually some of it can start in graduate school, so that whole window of time really is because unlike undergrad where you take a certain number of courses, you check them off your list, and after you've completed those, you graduate automatically. There's a research component. A PhD in psychology is any PhD in any field is a research degree, and the research is original research, so you are determining what you're interested in, you're collecting information, and you're analyzing it. And that's the variable that could lead to whether you're out in 5 or you're out in 10. And, we err on the side of wanting to get out as soon as possible.
Right.
So personally, some of the obstacles for me, I had a very ambitious plan for what I wanted to do for my research. And it turned out to be great on paper, but logistically, it took longer than expected.
Gotcha.
I would say one other challenge is that afterwards, after you graduate, you have to have supervision for a little while before you can be licensed. So many people can be psychologists, but they can't officially be called a clinical psychologist until they're licensed. And all that really means is that they can do all kinds of work, but they just would always have to have someone who is licensed to sign off on their work and to make sure that everything is okay. So that part, the licensure part, can be also something that is, can take a few months if you have time to study for it, or it could take longer.
Well, what about you, Dr. Priest? What are some of the obstacles that you encounter in your professional career?
Well, again, to build on what Dr. Lynch said, when I finished school, after I practiced for a few years in New York, but then I got married, and then my husband was military, so it involved moving around. And one thing about licensure is you have to be licensed generally in the state that you practice in.
Right.
For example, in the DMV, you could, if you're practicing in DC, if you want to also practice in Maryland, you need to get a Maryland license, Virginia license. There's no what they call reciprocity in most states. There are some isolated states, but for the most part, there's not. So it means you do have to take a test for that state, and the reason why the licensing you have to get licensed in that state is because of the licensing laws. The laws governing psychology vary from state to state. So in order to really practice ethically and proficiently, you need to be familiar with the laws in that state.
How hard would either you say, taking the question off the beaten path a little bit, how hard would you say it is to get a clinical psychologist, become a clinical psychologist in this day and age, looking at raising families or just being out socially and having to be dedicated to hours and hours of training? How hard is it, would you say?
Well, I would say nowadays, again, you have to be committed to the time because you're talking about 4 years of undergraduate school, 5 to 6 years of graduate school. I'm sorry, undergraduate 4 years, 5 to 6 years of graduate school. And also, I forgot to mention, in the training nowadays, you could get a PhD, as Dr. Lynch and I have, but also there's something called the PsyD, a doctor of psychology, which also would take 4 to 5 years. Nowadays, to get a PhD, though, from what people are telling me, you really need to have some work experience and or research experience before you even apply to the PhD program. So you really need to have a love of learning, I would say.
Dr. Lynch, what would you say is an essential skill in your job?
Essential skill, and there are lots of areas of psychology besides clinical psychology, so I say for anybody who's interested in psychology, obviously having a natural curiosity about people and compassion, empathy for others. I agree that you have to have a genuine love for learning. I feel like when you pursue particularly a graduate degree in any field, but particularly one that's going to take 5 or 6 years of your life, you have to be fully committed. It's not something you're just going to throw your hat in the ring because you want to go to grad school because you think that's the natural next progression from undergrad. It has to be something, and I tell students all the time, you're going to have a love and hate relationship with the research, with the process, and at those times when you're not feeling it so much, you have to be committed. You have to have something deep down that you can dig into to pursue and to be persistent in that field. So definitely have persistence and a passion for what you're doing.
Dr. Priest, what advice would you give to high school students who are interested in the field of psychology?
I would definitely encourage them to work on their writing skills.
Okay. As
a researcher or a clinician, you're going to need to have good writing skills in order to write papers, to write reports.
Okay.
Math skills are important in order to do research and then to understand research. It's important to be able to understand the research in whatever field you're going in. So you need to understand those statistics and how those statistics are being utilized. And also, as you mentioned, that connection between the brain and behavior. You need to have an understanding of biology and the science behind mental health. That will help you to be a better psychologist.
So if you don't like science, don't pursue psychology.
Well, you know, again, we've learned so much now between the connection between the brain and behavior. Back when I was in school, the emphasis was not as much on that. But the 90s was the decade of the brain. A lot of the research that was done on the brain relates to mental health.
Gotcha. Last question, both of you. Now, how can parents and educators, and I'll start with you, Dr. Lynch, how can parents and educators prepare students for college? What can they do? What can be done, I should say?
For college in general?
Yes.
I think being open and being encouraging and finding out what their students or their children are interested in, helping them be exposed to those people. This is why I love the fact that you have this program. Simply having an idea of what it takes, what kinds of skills are necessary, having opportunities to have face-to-face conversations with those people. So take them to open houses. If you have people in your family or your sphere of friends that are in those professions, have them have an opportunity to talk to them, to be mentored by them. Mentoring, I can't say enough about how important that is, just so you make the right steps and make the right moves and have a clear understanding of what the path involves.
Same question, Dr. Priest. How can parents and educators prepare students for college?
Again, I agree to find out what their passion is, encourage them to pursue their passions as opposed to your passion. Because I really believe that whatever it is your passion, if you're passionate about it, you're going to be good at it. You're going to be sure that you get the skills and you're going to want to continue to learn, which is also part of being a psychologist. To maintain your license, there's continuing education involved. And then for you to continue to do that and enjoy that and be able to apply it to what you're doing, you need to be passionate about what you're doing. Any
final words, Dr. Priest, Dr. Lynch? Any final words?
I would say being a psychologist, there's a lot of variety. You mentioned there's a lot of different fields in psychology, where even within clinical psychology, there's so many things you could do. You could work in private practice, you could work in schools, hospitals, academic settings. There's different kinds of psychologists. There's great earning potential, and there's a great opportunity to set your own schedule depending on what you do. So I think psychology is a great field that I still enjoy.
Excellent, excellent. Dr. Lynch?
I agree. One of the things I love about this field, and particularly clinical psychology, is the amount of choices that it gives you. So as I mentioned, my path is in clinical psychology, but as I mentioned, I work at Bowie State University. It was something that I took as a short-term deviation from working with some very intense clients. But it's the fact that I have this degree allows me to work as a professor, to work in to do consulting, to do things like that, to have a side hustle, as I call it, to do different things. So there's lots of variety there. I definitely appreciate there's everything in life relates to psychology. A lot of people think that it's just about disorders and it's just about finding out what's wrong with people. But there's so much that we know from our research that helps us understand what's good about people, what makes people resilient, and helps people to develop healthy and to have better lives. So there's so much that's positive about it that I feel like enriches everyone's life.
No problem. I can go on with you guys forever. I love the field of psychology. My background is psychology. But now, I guess I just wanted to question, what's been the challenge for you transitioning from the clinical setting to the classroom?
Interesting question. As I mentioned, this wasn't something that I had put on my 5-year plan of what I was going to do after I graduated. It actually was something, an opportunity came up after I finished a postdoc. And a postdoc, just so you know, is a final year of training after you've already received your doctorate degree. So I was working with seriously emotionally disturbed clients, adults and children. And for anybody who's worked in clinical psychology, you know that sometimes you need a little respite yourself. You need to find ways to balance that. So an opportunity to teach came up, and I took that. The challenge for me is because I was trained strictly in therapy and testing, I didn't have that academic background. So although I had a love for teaching and I enjoyed it, compared to colleagues that may have already had more training in the classroom, learning about teaching pedagogies and philosophies. I didn't have one of those when I came in. So kind of learning that along the way was a little bit challenging, but I think as long as you, again, have a thirst for the experience, a desire to work with students, everything else will kind of fill in as you go along.
And Dr. Priest, how do some advice to some of these psychologists in the field? How can you prevent burnout?
I think you need to have a balanced life. You know, your job and your profession are important to you, but I think it's important to have other hobbies, to have a life outside of your career. And I think that helps keep you balanced and also helps keep you from burning out.
Excellent. We'd like to thank both our guests, Dr. Angela Priester and Dr. Ayanna Lynch. We'll be back. Welcome back to the Launchpad. I'm your host, Harry Washington, and today we're joined by Dr. Mbila Shaka with the Association of Black Psychologists. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm very, very excited to be here.
Now, what is the mission of the Association of Black Psychologists?
Okay. The mission and vision of the Association of Black Psychologists is threefold. The first is the liberation of the African mind. The second is the empowerment of the African character. And the third is the illumination of the African spirit. So I know that's kind of broad and aspirational in goals, but it really connects to promoting African psychology as a field and Black psychology as a field of study. Getting students interested in African or Black psychology, since it isn't always part of the curriculum at universities, whether at predominantly white universities or HBCUs, but also to really engage in social justice work, so to make changes in the Black community.
Now, what led to the formation of the association?
Okay, there are several things that led to the formation, but from the stories that I've heard, it started in 1968, and as we know, 1968 was a very big year for Black Power or the assassination of Dr. King. But specifically in 1968 at the American Psychological Association, that there was a group of Black psychologists that met probably in a hotel suite. And they were just very dissatisfied with APA. They were dissatisfied because they didn't feel like the American Psychological Association really met the needs of the Black community, actually saw them from a deficit approach or model, and didn't really accept some of the research of Black psychologists. So they met in this hotel room to form some sort of caucus or decide if they should have a caucus with the APA. But they ended up deciding that they should completely break off from American Psychological Association and start their own organization, so the Association of Black Psychologists, and understanding that Black was the primary identity and psychologist was secondary. So all of the work that they would do would be for the betterment of the Black community, and then eventually psychology.
Now, your organization is a membership-based organization. How many members do you have?
So at the national level, it's an estimate that there are about 1,400 members, but in terms of the DC Association of Black Psychologists, we have about 50 members. But way more than 50 people come out to our events. That we have probably over 100 people at some of our community events. So, and the majority of our members are actually students. I think since the area has a lot of schools, we recruit a lot from the university.
Now, how often do you host events?
We have an event about once a month. It varies in terms of if it's a weekday or a weekend, but we have some flexibility in
Can
our
anyone
events.
come?
anyone can come, and they're usually free.
Okay,
I
cool.
would say 99.9% it's going to be free. Even we have an upcoming conference at Howard University on April 5th that is a conference for students hosted by the Association of Black Psychologists. So it's going to be really, really interesting. They're going to have talks about the psychological use of the N-word.
Okay.
Even psychotherapy, the study in psychology of hair, something that I'll present on, and a lot of various topics presented by students.
All right. Now, then your position, what does it entail?
So as the president of DC Association of Black Psychologists, I guess I can coordinate everything in terms of the programming and finding forums and collaborating with other organizations. Also helping with fundraising to be able to support our events, since we always want to feed people. That's a rule. You can't just have people come and not feed them. You got to keep their bellies full. But also addressing outreach and consultation needs. So if there's an organization or an institution that needs some help from Black psychologists, we hope to provide some free or low-cost services.
Gotcha. Now, why is it important? Because you said that was the base of the organization, but why is it important to incorporate those things into psychology, Black and Afrocentric aspects into psychology?
Okay, that's a really, really good question. Basically, the answer is race and culture matters. And so when we think about psychology or American psychology, it doesn't always value race and culture, when that's a big part of the daily lived experience for Black people in this country. To some degree, oppression has a psychological aspect, and so we hope to really target it from a racial and a cultural perspective.
Any final words, Doctor?
Well, I guess I just want to promote mental health amongst the Black community. That oftentimes we have limited access to treatment. We don't always know the psychologists in our community, but definitely visit absci.org to check out more information on the organization, or even to get listings of Black psychologists in the DC area.
Excellent. Excellent. We'd like to thank all of our guests, and definitely Dr. M. Bilishaka, and to learn more about them, view our credits, or go to their websites. Stay tuned, because we have a very special video for you.
Little bit. Who here has just tasted a lemon? You just bitten a little bit out of a lemon. What does it taste like?
Sour.
Sour, right? Anybody else? Hold on to the litmus paper and watch what color it turns.
Blue,
So this is laundry soap, right? So the laundry soap.
We would almost think that our wallet is going up in flames. Wow. In DC, we have access to the DC College TAG program. And it pays up to $10,000 a year, cumulative award amount $50,000 for those who are attending a public four-year institution. College ain't cheap, y'all.
I am the, how's the best way to put this? I am an astronomer. But my astronomy is a little bit different than most other people's astronomy. Unfortunately, as an astronomer, I can't go to the nearest star. I mean, I could, but it'd be like millions or thousands, hundreds of millions. And they're hoping that they can get a space-based telescope, like the Webb, James Webb, yeah, that's one of them. Okay, a couple other ones up there, to look at these planets around other stars and be able to tell if there's aliens of any kind, okay?
Now, today, not very many people know Morse code, but years ago, we had something called the telegraph industry here in this country. We had wired up the whole country so that if you wanted to send a message quickly to somebody here from Washington, D.C., let's say to Chicago or Los Angeles, so let me turn this on here. Okay, so I'm going to have a long and two shorts. That's a letter B. An R is a short, a long, and a short. That's an R. I is two shorts. That's an I. So Brian would sound like this. In fact, the transistors inside a microprocessor are so tiny that you need an incredibly powerful microscope to even see them. So if you have a laptop computer, your microprocessor may have, I don't know, 70 million transistors.
But for me, I want to do first example. It's just like a big area, but I don't know how to get that specific.
I'm gonna tell you, there is no specifics until you're in it. So, what I mean by that is, to get to a level of specificity with any field, you have to study it broad.
College is really more about coverage, exposure, and relevance, right? You will expose yourself to a lot of different fields, a lot of different interests, so you get a lot of surface, right? Grad school is when you specialize, you go more in depth, okay?
Go and get into the teacher spaces because they know about it, and they can give you that information, but you have to ask for it.
I would say something else, like if you maybe don't have the opportunity to do enrichment programs, I'm not sure if Zoom, does anybody know show Zoom? Decided to, no, you guys don't. Okay, well, I think that they still air it on PBS, and you know, everybody has PBS and we have a television. So they do like a lot of experiments. There's, you know, books. When I was younger, I had like 100 experiments to do like in your kitchen. So it shows you different aspects.
Our cars, you know, again, reduce pollution and the impact they help with the river stream. So I think you can start just by working these groups and also starting your own club or participating in a club where they do, even the Girl Scouts, cover the environmental stuff as well. Because the work that I do is about, really it is about affecting social change.
STEM careers, I would say that graduating from Howard in May, I had 2 job offers, and you know, like, obviously that's a blessing.
You know, what we've been talking about today and just different avenues or ways to kind of get to those end degrees. And we've been talking about college on a very like basic kind of things and tools you might need to pursue to get to the end level.